Hey, and welcome back to another NFL Rough Draft Walter Football Camp recap. Today we're going to close things out with the news from the NFC West and the NFC South from the first week and a half of practice. And again, my goal is to try to get you as much information as possible in as little time as possible. But today I do have two quick things that I need to get to before we jump into this, and it's a spicy one today. There's some interesting things going on in the NFC West. But first, after today, it's not the end of our series. I'm still going to be doing this daily, except they're going to be much shorter videos that are going to recap the latest news in the entirety of the NFL. And so you won't have these long 20-minute videos. You'll have a quick 8 to 10-minute recap of everything that happened that particular day. And the second thing I want to get to real quick before we get started here is a huge shout out to Carl, who was in the comment section of yesterday's video. We were talking about the Noah Fant signing with the Cincinnati Bengals. And, you know, I talked about how I thought it was a little bit of a redundant signing because he and Eric All have very similar skill sets. Well, Eric All, remember, he tore his ACL in college. He had a back injury before that where he missed the end of the season. And last year he tore his ACL in week 9. Well, tearing your ACL in week 9 ordinarily would allow you to probably come back toward the beginning, if not at the beginning of the following year. But I had forgotten that he had a setback. Okay, so the ACL that he tore was the same ACL he tore the previous season, and he's most likely not going to play this year. He might not play again, you know, hopefully he does, but certainly that changes things. Noah Fant will have that role as the second tight end, and the second tight end in the Bengals offense actually has value. It's not a backup position. Okay, I mentioned they play a lot of 12 personnel. So that was my mistake, missing that Eric All setback with his ACL. And shout out to Carl in the comment section for bringing that up. Okay, thank you for that. I'm never going to run from making a mistake. I'll admit it. Okay, so thank you for that. All right, now let's jump into the NFC West and the NFC South. And we're going to start with the Los Angeles Rams. Everybody in fantasy football has got their eye on that handcuff running back position. We know that Sean McVay likes to use one running back. And, you know, even if it historically has been someone who's not that good, like a Henderson or a Cam Akers, that player still ends up being very relevant in fantasy football because they get so many opportunities. And really, the news so far has been positive on both Blake Corum and Jarquez Hunter. So that just hasn't shaken out yet. It's something I'll continue to keep an eye on and update you when there's, you know, something more meaningful that comes out of that situation. But the big story here is a 7th round rookie wide receiver from the University of Pittsburgh named Kanata Mumpfield. Kanata Mumpfield. Let me tell you right now, if you're in a dynasty league, go add him to your roster. Okay? The Rams have a long history of being able to find these day 3 steals. Okay, Puka Nacua is obviously a big one, but Kyron Williams, the starting running back, he was a 4th or 5th round pick. He was day 3. Tyler Higbee was a day 3 pick. They just are good at finding these players on offense on day 3. And coming into camp, I had my eyes on Jordan Whittington because he was pretty solid in camp last year, and I thought maybe he would have an expanded role, and he still might. It's early in camp. But the talk of Rams camp has been Kanata Mumpfield. In Dynasty, go add him. If you know you're in a regular redraft league where you have very shallow rosters, like, you know, 14, 15 players, I would shy away. In best ball, you know, I've been talking about these players that you could get in the last round that might give you an advantage because they might not be rostered in a lot of leagues. Okay, so if you're in one of these best ball tournaments where the winner wins $1 million. Well, you might be able to go and get Kanata Mumpfield in the 20th round, and he is not going to be rostered in almost every single league that's drafted so far. Certainly, none of the leagues that were drafted before camp started. But I'm spending extra time to emphasize that this is a player that in Dynasty could really work his way into a role in another year or so, with Devontae Adams turning 33 later this year. But I still think that there's a chance he could have some redraft value here if the ball starts to roll in his direction here, or continues to roll in his direction here. He's really been the star of camp so far. So that's a big story. If you pay attention to anything from this video, that's the guy. All right, so that's the news going on with the Rams. We're going to move on. We're going to go to the 49ers. And, if you've been watching Walt and his drafts, he's talked a lot about the 49ers and how they have a really easy schedule this year. Now, you never truly know how easy the schedule is going to be for sure, right? I mean, every year is different in the NFL. And sometimes they look one way in the preseason and they don't work out that way. Last year, everybody thought the Minnesota Vikings were going to be in contention for the first overall pick, and look at that. They won 14 games. However, the 49ers still have a lot of talent on that offense. The schedule is looking to be favorable, and Brandon Ayuk is going to miss a lot of time. He's not going to be back till midseason. Juwan Jennings is banged up right now. Okay, I'm sure this doesn't seem like anything big. It seems like he'll be back in a few days. Demarcus Robinson, speaking of the Rams, right? He was with the Rams last year. He's going to be suspended. Okay, he had a DUI incident, and he's getting suspended for probably 1 to 3 games. Ricky Pearsall is the guy to own here. And again, Walt, I think, mentioned to me that Ricky Pearsall is his most rostered wide receiver in best ball. You can currently get him in the 7th, 8th. He's there in the later part of the mid rounds, and you can get a potential value by drafting Pearsall there. On top of Ayuk being out for a while, okay, he's not going to be a factor until midseason, and Jennings being a little bit banged up now. Plus, Jennings is kind of like a known commodity, right? Like he had that big game last year, and he's a good player, but he's not really a number 1 type receiver, whereas Pearsall might be. But on top of that, the depth at receiver has really taken a hit. Okay, Jacob Cowan, the 4th round, second-year player out of Arizona, he was someone I had my eye on in camp early because the reviews were that he was looking much improved this year, and there's opportunity there. But he's been out with a hamstring injury, okay? So we'll see how he bounces back, but he's out of action right now. The team just turned over the entire bottom half of their receiving room, okay? And they signed Andy Isabella and a couple other guys who are not going to be factors once the season starts. So Ricky Pearsall, that arrow is pointing straight up, okay? So he's a value right now where he's getting picked in redraft. The running back situation, I'm a big fan of McCaffrey. I've been saying I would take him over Jahmyr Gibbs this year. And Isaac Guerendo is my most rostered dynasty player. Okay, I think he's a high upside handcuff. But just keep in mind, Jordan James is also off to a good start to camp. If you're a college football fan, you know Jordan James from Oregon. Of course, the natural comparison that everybody was making around NFL draft season was Bucky Irving, right? Bucky Irving was Oregon's running back the previous year. He was a day 3 pick, just like James, and look at the season he had for Tampa Bay. Now, I'm not predicting that, but in dynasty leagues, Jordan James isn't going to be on your waiver wire unless it's a very shallow league. But he might be someone worth trading maybe a future 3rd round pick for if your rookie draft has already happened. All right, so that's the 49ers. the Cardinals don't have a lot going on that's really newsworthy, right? Like we talked about the NFC North yesterday. I didn't really talk about the Lions because the Lions kind of their fantasy football, their personnel has kind of already been decided. There's not really going to be anything surprising there. At least there isn't anything on the radar yet. And the Cardinals are kind of in that same boat. Um, Marvin Harrison's bulked up. He's having a good camp. If you've been a Cardinals fan for long enough, you're kind of hoping that that's not it's not a David Boston type bulk up. But I don't think that that's the case. I expect a second-year leap from Marvin Harrison. I really like him at his current redraft price, which is the third round. But there's not a lot to talk about with the Cardinals as of this moment. Move on to the Seahawks, and really here the big story is Torrey Horton. Okay, so if you follow the NFL draft closely, Torrey Horton was supposed to be a third-round pick. Everybody kind of thought that he was underrated and he'd be a top 100 pick. He was in our top 100, and he fell to early day 3. Well, the Seahawks are right now Horton is making it look like the Seahawks got a value there. It looks like he could be a nice value, and he's getting some reps with the first team. Now, if you're like me and Walt, we kind of think that Cooper Kupp has already shown signs of being broken down. So that offense is obviously going to run through Jackson Smith-Njigba, but beyond that, if Kupp is broken down, there's some opportunity for Torrey Horton there. And then the other big story is Elijah Arroyo. Okay, this is another one where if you follow the NFL draft, there's some of us who think that Elijah Arroyo could be the next George Kittle. Right now, keep in mind George Kittle wasn't George Kittle right off the bat as a rookie. Okay, but he's got some big upside. They released Noah Fant, as we talked about in previous episodes, and if you're drafting a best ball team and you're looking for sort of your tight end 2, and it gets later, and a lot of the other tight end 2s are some of the guys in that tight end 13 to tight end 15 or 16 range are already off the board. Well, you can take a nice shot on Elijah Arroyo here. He's a height, weight, speed guy. I'm sure he's gonna, even if he doesn't have consistent production this year, I would expect that he would have some big games, or he's at least capable of having a couple of big plays and stretching the field. So Elijah Arroyo is interesting, and at running back, this is kind of like a side note. This is for dynasty leagues, and it's really for deep dynasty leagues. But Kenny McIntosh, the second-year running back out of Georgia, tore his ACL, and that really opens the door for Damian Martinez to make the team. You can argue that Damian Martinez might have made the team even before that. But remember, this is a really, really deep running back class in the NFL draft. And, Damian Martinez, I thought in other years would have been a 4th-round pick. The Seahawks got him later. And, let's see what he does in the preseason. But I think that he's getting pretty close to being a roster lock now that Kenny McIntosh is going to miss the year. So that's the Seahawks. That is the NFC West. We're going to move on to the NFC South to close out our division recap of camp. And we're going to start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard that the news here is that Chris Godwin, the concerns about him not being recovered from his dislocated ankle were valid. Now, be careful here because we still don't really know what's going on. We know that he had a second surgery at some point over the offseason. We also know that the Buccaneers gave him a pretty decent contract extension. So they obviously feel like he's going to return to form at some point. But we just don't know when he's going to be back. We could be doing this a week from now, and I could be telling you that he's back in camp. And, maybe on track to play week 1. But there's another scenario where he's out until October. Okay, so he's on the PUP list right now. Everybody freaks out because people don't really understand the PUP list, right? When camp starts, if you're not ready to go, you can be placed on the PUP list. And a lot of people read that as a player is placed on the PUP list, so he's going to miss time in the regular season. Sometimes that's the case. Okay, but it's not always the case. You can have guys who just kind of show up and, maybe they just signed, or maybe they have some kind of circumstance where they're still rehabbing from an injury and they need another few days or a week. Sort of like Ricky Pearsall, who we talked about earlier, right? He started camp on the PUP list this year and everybody freaked out. Okay, and then a couple days later, he was activated from the PUP list because he was fine. But the 49ers were just looking for a couple days of a roster exemption because they're taking things slow because it's July and there are no games in July. So we still don't really know what's going on with Godwin. He could be back next week. He could be back in October. So Emeka Egbuka has really stepped up, and people are raving about his start to camp. Now that's caused his ADP to rise to 7th round. Still worth a shot there in redraft. It's a high-powered offense. I think that there's a possibility that it could lead to Jalen McMillan or maybe even Chris Godwin being of value. Okay, because Jalen McMillan was a 3rd-round pick last year. He had a pretty decent rookie season, and nobody's talking about him. Egbuka is overshadowing him. But be careful with just relying on camp notes. Okay, when the season starts, it wouldn't surprise me to see him sort of take the reins early if Godwin's still out, and sort of be the guy that gets relied upon a little bit more. Aside from that, it's not much going on of note in Bucs camp. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the Atlanta Falcons, and my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to say this. I think I need to join some sort of a group for recovery on this. I was out on Kyle Pitts. Finally, it took me long enough. He had a 1,000-yard season his rookie year and just hasn't come close. We heard all this talk in the spring about how his issue is that, maybe he's not giving his best effort. All right, the coaches talked about wanting to see him play fast. And, at that point, it just kind of felt like this is a 15th or 16th round pick, and I can't justify putting him any higher because it just doesn't look like it's going to happen. Well, camp started, and there are a couple interesting notes. First, Michael Penix is talking him up. He's saying, we're going to get him the ball. Okay, that's a little bit interesting. It sounds like he's looked good. Here's the interesting nugget. He's been working with the wide receivers. This is a team that's really thin at wide receiver. Drake London is obviously going to get a bunch of targets. Beyond that, Darnell Mooney, I'm sure, will too when he gets back, but he's going to miss most of camp and possibly even week 1 or a couple weeks of the regular season, okay, because he's hurt. If Kyle Pitts, if they're using him, there's not much difference between how they were already using him and how you would use a wide receiver, okay, so I don't want to completely blow this out of the water, but I think that opportunity is there for him. Now, I'm not saying you're going to be drafting him in the 4th or 5th or 6th round. Okay, we're not doing that. But he's interesting. Okay, when you get to that 10th, 11th, 12th round, and you've completely missed on the top 13 or 14 tight ends, there are worse gambles to take than Kyle Pitts. Okay, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but, he still does have that league-winning potential, especially now that you can go get him in the 11th or 12th round. So maybe, if you're feeling like taking a gamble here and you miss out on a lot of those tight ends or they get overdrafted, go take Kyle Pitts in the 12th round and maybe he ends up finally performing like that third or fourth round tight end that he's been projected to be since he had that 1,000-yard rookie season. All right, moving on. The Carolina Panthers. Okay, the Carolina Panthers. The story there is Ted McMillan looks great. Okay, he sounds like he's catching everything. The concern with him at draft time was simply his desire to want to work and be great, and it sounds like he's off to a good start. So Ted McMillan's interesting. Sounds like he's going to get a ton of targets, and there's other good news. It sounds like Bryce Young has taken another step forward. All right, if you get second half of the season of 2024 Bryce Young, that's interesting. If he takes another step forward, well, now that's really interesting for both Bryce Young and Ted McMillan. Okay, so if you're looking for that totally off the radar sort of stack in best ball, or even in redraft, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to have Bryce Young as your starting quarterback. I don't know how you'd get yourself in that situation in the preseason, but maybe you're in a super flex league and you need a QB2, or maybe you're in some really deep league, like you play FFPC like I do, and some teams have 3 quarterbacks rostered. Bryce Young is interesting. Could this be the story of this year, where Bryce Young and Ted McMillan, or maybe even Xavier Legette, who looks locked into that second wide receiver role, are they potential league winners this year? Well, I wouldn't bet on it, but so far it sounds like they're off to a good start in camp. Okay, so this is going to be a really fascinating team to sort of track as camp goes on. They're a fun team. All right, we're going to close things out with maybe one of the worst teams in the NFL, and I apologize if there are Saints teams watching. Don't worry, I'm a Raider fan. I get it. But the Saints, there's not a lot that's interesting going on here. Tyler Shuck is struggling a little bit. We knew he was a little bit of a gunslinger, which could be both good and bad, right? For fantasy, it's kind of good, right? Everybody loves Jameis Winston because he'll drive down the field and complete all these passes, and then he'll throw an interception that gets returned 90 yards for a touchdown, and then the offense gets the ball right back. Okay, so maybe if Tyler Shuck wins this job, and right now it's a 3-man competition between Shuck, not Desmond Ridder, my gosh, the quarterback from South Carolina who they drafted on day 3 last year, Spencer Rattler, and Jake Haener, okay, the Fresno State quarterback. So it's a 3-man competition between them. Maybe if Shuck gets that spot, though, there's some reason to like Kamara and Chris Olave, okay? Because we know Kellen Moore, their new head coach, likes to run a lot of plays. Running a lot of plays is good for fantasy football. Having a team that's going to be losing a lot is good for fantasy football, right? So, and having a gunslinger quarterback, if Shuck is the quarterback, is good for fantasy football. So you could see a guy like Chris Olave have a lot of volume. He usually does. He just needs to avoid the concussions. And you could see an older back like Alvin Kamara have a good fantasy year, even without necessarily having a good regular year. Now, what does that mean? Some people think, I know Walt does not like Alvin Kamara, and I understand where he's coming from. Okay, I think he's 30 years old now, which is a point where running backs tend to fall off a cliff. He's never had over 950 yards rushing in a season. But in PPR leagues, which it's not 1996, so you're probably playing in a PPR league, he doesn't need to have a lot of yards. He doesn't need to look explosive. Okay? He just needs to have 90 targets. Okay? We're losing. Let's check the ball down to Alvin Kamara. And if he gets those 90 targets, he's going to be a top 12 running back, which is a value in the 4th round. So that's my deal with the Saints. I'm keeping an eye on Keandre Miller and Devin Neal. I'll believe it when I see it with Keandre Miller, but it sounds like he's healthy. He doesn't have Dennis Allen there just tearing him down every day. anymore. And Devin Neal, it's kind of like Damian Martinez from the Seahawks. He's a 4th-round pick in a different draft year, but there's so much depth in this running back class. The Saints got him later. The reason these two are interesting is just because if the Saints are bad like we expect them to be, maybe they trade Alvin Kamara before the trade deadline around Halloween, and one of these two backs ends up being the starter. And, you could probably do worse if one of them is the starter in your running back 2 spot, or, a desperation flex play, even though you probably want to be playing a wide receiver in your flex. All right, so that's our camp news for the entire NFL from the first week and a half of camp. Again, the reason why I waited to start this was because the first few days of camp, not much happens, right? You don't have players practicing in full pads yet at that point. And so I wanted to give it a little bit of time so we weren't overreacting to just any little thing that happens, like Ricky Pearsall, I mentioned earlier, starting camp on the PUP list for a couple of days. Going forward, we're going to have daily league-wide camp updates, and we're going to go over some fantasy football draft strategies as well. Continue to throw those comments down there. Any questions that you have, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And thanks again for watching. I'll catch you next time. Hey, welcome back to another NFL Rough Draft.